What Ayasha did with the remaining years of her life is a quieter story, and in some ways a more extraordinary one. She did not become famous. She did not become an activist or a symbol or a cause. She was a woman who cooked her own food and kept a small garden and walked every morning down to the creek at the edge of the property she had lived on for decades. And she did these things while carrying inside her the entire weight of a vanished world. She spoke to herself. That detail comes from neighbors who knew her in her later years, who would sometimes catch her at the window or in the garden murmuring softly, not to anyone present but to the air, in sounds they could not parse. She was not losing her mind. She was not lonely in the way people assumed. She was simply doing what any person does when they love a language. She was using it. She was keeping it alive in the only way still available to her. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name in English, but it is the loneliness of being the last person who can say a thing. Not the last person who wants to say it, not the last person who values it, but the last person for whom saying it is possible. It is the loneliness of a song you cannot teach because there is no notation system for it. It is the loneliness of a color you can see perfectly and describe to no one. Dr. Marsh visited her 7 more times over the following decade. He brought colleagues. He brought graduate students. He brought better recording equipment as it became available. What they produced together was the most complete documentation of the language that would ever exist, an archive of sound that now lives in a university collection, carefully preserved, occasionally studied, never spoken by anyone who learned it as a mother tongue. Ayasha cooperated with all of it. She answered every question. She repeated words slowly when asked. She translated stories that had taken her grandmother hours to tell, collapsing them into 30-minute recordings for the sake of the archive. She did all of this without bitterness and without complaint, though Dr. Marsh wrote in a later reflection that he believed, looking back, that she was grief-stricken in a way that was simply too vast and too particular for anyone around her to recognize. She was not grieving a person. She was not grieving a place. She was grieving an entire way of being alive in the world. There is a moment that Dr. Marsh described in a paper he published near the end of his career, a paper that was more personal than academic in its tone, which is what happens sometimes to scholars who have spent decades sitting across tables from people who are the last of something. He described a day in 1979 when he arrived at Ayasha's home in early November and found her sitting outside on the wooden steps despite the cold, looking at the sky. He asked her what she was looking at. She said the word, a single word in her language. He asked her what it meant. She said it meant the sky when it is exactly this color, at exactly this time of year, on exactly this kind of day. The sky that means winter has decided, not arriving. Decided, she said there was a difference in her language between a winter that was coming and a winter that had made up its mind. He looked at the sky. It was the gray of old pewter, flat and total, without depth or variation. He wrote that he understood in that moment what was being lost. Not just the words, the perceptions. The language had trained its speakers to see a distinction in the sky that he had never noticed existed. A distinction between winter arriving and winter deciding. A distinction that required 2 different words and carried 2 different emotional registers. He could see it now that she had pointed it out. But he could only see it in English, and English would not let him keep it. That is what it means to lose a language. That is the truth that gets buried under the academic terminology of language death and endangered linguistics and cultural heritage preservation. It is not just words. It is the loss of particular ways of cutting the world at its joints. It is the loss of distinctions that only existed because a group of people paid close enough attention to their particular corner of the earth to notice that the differences were there. Every language that dies takes its perceptions with it. Ayasha stopped speaking English almost entirely in her final years. This is documented by the few people who remained in regular contact with her. She was not refusing to communicate, she was simply choosing. She had spent decades maintaining two worlds inside her head: the circular world without a word for tomorrow, and the linear English world where the future was always ahead of you, always pulling you forward, always something you had to worry about getting to. In her final years, she let one of those worlds go. She chose the one she had been born into. She chose the world where time moved in seasons rather than lines, where snow had 17 names, where the sky could decide, where the grief you feel for a place you have never been but somehow remember is real enough to require a word. Dr. Marsh received a phone call in the spring of 1984. Ayasha had died quietly in her home at the age of 60. The neighbor who called him said she had found her in the morning, in her chair by the window, looking out at the garden where the first green was just starting to come back into the world. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after the call ended. He thought about the archive. 47 hours of her voice. All those careful recordings. All those transcriptions and annotations and phonetic notations. All that documentation of something that could no longer be spoken by anyone alive. He thought about the words she had said that day on the steps, looking at the pewter sky. He thought about the difference between a winter arriving and a winter deciding. He thought about the fact that the language had no word for tomorrow, because what he understood now, sitting in his office with the phone going silent in his hand, was that a language built without a word for tomorrow is not a language built by people who could not see the future. It is a language built by people who understood something that the rest of the world has spent centuries forgetting. That the only moment you can ever truly inhabit is this one. That the only thing you can ever truly know is what is in front of you right now. The color of the sky today. The quality of this particular snow. The feeling in your chest when a certain light falls across a winter morning. That the future is not a place. That tomorrow is not a word. It is just this moment, arriving again. She was the last child born into a language with no word for tomorrow. And on the morning she died, looking out at a garden coming back to life, it is possible that she was not thinking about what had been lost at all. It is possible that she was simply watching the green return, the way it always returns, the way her language had always known it would, with a word for the comeback of things, even though it had never needed a word for where they were going. The recordings still exist. They sit in a climate-controlled archive, digitized now, preserved against decay, 47 hours of one woman's voice carrying an entire world in its sounds. Scholars study them, linguists transcribe them. Students listen with headphones and try to hear the shape of a consciousness that organized reality differently than anything they have ever been taught. None of them can speak it. None of them will ever dream in it. None of them will ever wake in the morning and murmur something about the birds, something about the color of pre-dawn sky, in a language that held the whole world in the present tense and trusted, without needing a word for it, that what came next would take care of itself. She knew something we have forgotten, and she took it with her, gently, in the early morning, with the garden just beginning to return. And the heartbreaking thing is not that her language died. The heartbreaking thing is that it spent 10,000 years teaching people how to live inside a single moment, and none of us knew enough to listen before the last voice went quiet. She did not know she was the last one. That is the detail that breaks you when you finally understand it. There was no ceremony the morning Ayasha woke up and spoke her first words of the day. No one gathered at the edges of her small wooden home to listen. No linguist leaned forward with a recording device. No government official stood waiting with a certificate declaring that what was happening inside those walls was history. She simply opened her eyes, felt the cold morning press against the window, and spoke to herself the way she always did, in the only language she had ever loved, in the only tongue that had ever felt like home. She said something about the birds. She said something about the color the sky makes just before full light. And without knowing it, she said these things in a language that had no word for tomorrow. Not because the people who built it were pessimists, not because they feared the future, but because they never needed one. Their world was circular. Their time moved in seasons and cycles and returns. The future was not a place you traveled toward. It was a place that came to you, the way a river always comes back to the sea. And now Ayasha was the only one left who understood that. Her name means one who is always alive in that language, which is one of those details that feels too meaningful to be accidental, and yet history is full of exactly these kinds of terrible ironies. She was born in the summer of 1923 in a valley that exists now only as a name on a map that most people have never opened. She was the youngest of 7 children. By the time she turned 30, she was the youngest of 0. The language she carried had no official name in the outside world. Scholars who encountered it briefly in the 1940s called it by the name of the valley where it was spoken, a small mountain community in the interior of what is now northwestern Canada, a place where perhaps 200 people had once lived in relative isolation, building a world entirely from the materials around them, including their words. They had no word for tomorrow, but they had 17 distinct words for different qualities of snow. They had a word that meant the sound a pine tree makes when it accepts that winter is coming. They had a phrase that translated roughly to the grief you feel for a place you have never been but somehow remember. They had a language so precise about the present moment, so deeply invested in the texture of now, that the idea of naming something as abstract as tomorrow had simply never occurred to anyone. And then the world arrived, the way it always does, uninvited and irreversible. It came first as a road. Roads are how the outside world announces itself to places that have spent centuries being left alone. This particular road was cut through the trees in 1931, when Ayasha was 8 years old and still small enough that her father could carry her on his back through deep snow without slowing his pace. She remembered the sound of it, the machines that came before the men, a grinding mechanical roar that sent the birds off the branches in long, dark lines against the sky. Her father stood at the edge of their clearing and watched the tree line shake. She asked him what it was. He told her in their language, in that precise and beautiful tongue, that it was the sound of something ending. She did not understand what he meant. She was 8. She thought he meant the trees. He meant everything else. The road brought people who spoke differently. It brought administrators and missionaries and teachers who arrived with the conviction that they were offering something, when what they were actually doing was taking. The children of the valley, including Ayasha and her brothers and her sisters and her cousins and every child she had ever known, were enrolled in schools where speaking their language was forbidden, where speaking it meant punishment, where a child could be struck across the knuckles for using the only words they had ever been given. This is not a new story. It has happened in more places than history has bothered to count. The specific mechanics of cultural erasure are grotesquely consistent across centuries and continents. Find a community, isolate the children, replace the language. Wait, but here is what the people who designed those systems never fully understood. Language is not just communication. It is not just a collection of sounds assigned to objects. Language is a way of thinking. It is the architecture of how a people understand reality itself. When you take a language from a child, you are not just changing how they speak. You are changing how they see. Ayasha came home that first summer different. Not in ways her parents could name, not in ways that showed on the outside, but something had shifted in the space behind her eyes. She still spoke the language at home. She still listened to her grandmother tell stories in the long winter nights, stories that existed in no written form, stories that lived only in the bodies of the people who carried them. But she was also starting to think in English. And English had a word for tomorrow. And once you have a word for tomorrow, you can never fully return to a world without one. Her brothers adapted faster than she did, which was partly because they were older and partly because they understood earlier that adaptation was survival. One by one, they drifted toward the towns along the road, toward work and wages and a version of a life that was legible to the world that had arrived. Her sisters married. Her parents aged in the way people age when their world has been rearranged around them without their consent, quietly and with a kind of dignified bewilderment. Her grandmother was the last of the true speakers before Ayasha. Her name translated to something like the one who holds the fire while others sleep. She was already old when Ayasha was born, old in the way that people who have lived close to the land become old, deeply and slowly, like a tree. She had learned the language as a child from her own grandmother, which meant the tongue that lived in her mouth stretched back through at least 4 generations of unbroken transmission. She died in 1961 on a night when the snow came so fast it buried the windowsills before morning. Ayasha held her hand. They spoke together until the very end, in that circular language with its 17 words for snow and its single exquisite blindness toward the future. Her grandmother told her things she had never told anyone else. Stories about the valley before the road. Stories about what the language contained that could not be carried in any other tongue. She told Ayasha about the word that meant the exact quality of light on the 3rd day after the longest night, when the world begins its return. She told her about the phrase that described the feeling of standing at the edge of your own life and understanding without fear that it was finite. There was no word for tomorrow, but there was that. Ayasha was 38 years old the morning she became the last speaker of her language. She did not know it yet. She would not know it for certain for another 11 years, until a linguist named Dr. Edwin Marsh arrived in 1972 with a reel-to-reel recorder and a list of questions and a look on his face that she recognized immediately as the look of someone who has come too late. She made him tea. She answered his questions. She sat across a small table from a man who could not understand a single word she said without a translator. And she recited for him everything she could remember. Every word, every phrase, every story, every structure, every grammatical peculiarity, every silence that the language required and that English simply could not accommodate. He recorded 47 hours of her voice. He told her carefully, gently, with the particular gentleness of a man delivering a verdict, that she was the last, that the searches his team had conducted through the surrounding communities had found no other fluent speakers, that there were partial speakers, people who remembered fragments, words their parents had used, phrases from childhood, but no one who could speak the way she spoke, no one who could think in it. She did not cry. He noted that in his field journal, which was later published as part of a larger academic study. He wrote that she received the information with a composure that he found both moving and unsettling. He wrote that she looked out the window for a long moment at the snow on the trees, and then said something in her language that she did not translate for him. He asked her later what she had said. She told him it was something that could not be said in English. He pressed her. She thought for a while. Then she said that the closest approximation would be something like, "This is the kind of ending that the language itself always knew was coming and prepared a word for, even if I never thought to use it." He wrote that down. He sat with it for a long time.